Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the UKZN and Centre for Creative Arts third edition of the Artfluence Human Rights Festival. My name is Scout Fynn, and I'm a part of the Emerging Arts Managers Program at the CCA. And today I will be facilitating the panel on gastronomy, decolonizing our diets. What flavors are South African gastronomers creating that speaks to indigenous ingredients and knowledge systems? So in the room with me today, I have Tapiwa Guzha, founder of Tapi Tapi Handmade African Ice Cream. Tapi Tapi is an educational initiative that is focused on sharing food and food culture from the African continent with other Africans and our visitors alike. Next, we have Aabida Davis, who runs Unrefined Juicery that uses indigenous ingredients like puchu, wild dacha, kankerbos, and sugarcane to make nutritious drinks. And last but not least, we have Dr. Qinsane Qwabe, who is the founder of Ubuntu Agri-Renaissance, which focuses on knowledge and livelihood development through inclusive agricultural systems. Welcome, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So just to give everybody some context for how we'll be running this webinar, before we get into the actual discussion, we're going to have two very special guest panelists' videos play for us. And then I will ask our panelists just to have a response to that. If anything immediate comes up, and then we'll start the panel discussion. So first, we'll have Roushanna Grave of Felt and See and Jane Nshuti.
I was born in Rwanda and I also got a chance to be in other African countries, and I just enjoyed the simplicity of African food. We didn't do a lot of processed food, so it was like natural food, but with really their own flavors, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the cassava leaves with the peanut flour. I enjoyed green banana, almost curry-ish. I just loved that our food was natural with the original taste. And that is really flavors that I grew up. And everywhere we went as a family growing up, we discovered the food from that area. And it was always an amazing experience. For me, I'm interested in indigenous food and local flavors, mainly because, especially in Africa, our food has been looked down on. Our food is getting lost into this globalization, and you find that we are expected to accept other people's food and eat that than our own food, and that takes away a part of our heritage. It takes away who we are as a people, and it when you are not comfortable with your own food, you're not comfortable with yourself. Like, that is really robbing us of that, and we can't have our food being the lost food. It's we should be proud of who we are as a people. And also it's cheaper when you eat local, when you eat things that grows indigenously. And I think it's about time that we start bringing it back into the society. It is so sad that in Africa, you are easily able to get quinoa than fonio in an African supermarket, and so it's very hard to source food, indigenous food in Africa. You have to go into all these corner shops all over, and it's it's hardly um, it's hardly possible to find indigenous food in large supermarkets. So you have to go to local stands or just a particular supplier to actually get that. Sometimes they are expensive, sometimes they are cheap, but the expensive ones, it's because this food has no demand. And I'm like, can't we just all start eating it so that it gets cheaper? So yeah. Um, Both. For me, I am a chef, so creativity comes first. I think it's important to promote indigenous flavors and local flavors to remind us of our ancestors and who we are and what our parents ate. But it's also good to find new adaptation, to find new things and expose our ingredients to new flavors. So I take an ingredient and I figure out what I think else can be done with it. I'm not big on sticking to just how my mom cooked it. I love that, but I also want to experience other way of creating food that anybody can enjoy. Being It has never been easy being a pioneer, and we bringing these African flavors which has been forgotten for a very long time. It has been really difficult. Food is very political, and we have really been conditioned for a very long time that our food, it's needs to be looked down on. It's not good as French food cuisine. It's not good as American or Italian, and so it's very hard to convince people that this is as amazing. It's healthier, and so you first need to do the groundwork. You first need to do the groundwork before anybody even gets to feel a need to want to add that into their diet. I will say that as especially as chefs, we are the ones which brings recipes, new flavors to the world. Once we start bringing all these amazing flavors instead of just making food that everyone is making, um, for example, let me give one example. I can never be the most amazing chef who makes French cuisine that I have accepted, but I can be the best chefs who make African cuisine because I'm an African, because it's in my blood. I know what to do with that. But by learning what other people do and try to overtake them in it. No, let's start from home. Let's start from home, build our own cuisine, and grow our own culinary experiences, and just get people to love who we are instead of going to other parts of the world and try to be like them.
Wow. Shout out to Rosanna and Jane for giving us an incredible springboard to start this conversation on decolonizing our diets, right? And, just responding immediately from what both of them have said, I think food is something that's very evocative by nature, right? It connects us to our senses, to taste, to smell, and to sound, but also to memory and place and to our cultural heritage. So, my first question for the group is, what was your experience with food like growing up? What were the different flavors that you experienced, and what kind of impression did they leave on you?
Can I start?
Go for it.
Yes, please.
Okay, growing up in the northern KwaZulu Natal in a rural area called Nshuti, almost everyone in my village was consuming indigenous vegetables. When I speak of those, I speak of your taros, madumbis, as they are commonly known here in South Africa, your sweet potatoes, which is different from what you get at Woolies and Pick and Pay, by the way, Bambara ground nuts, and others. But we also had our green leafy vegetables like your blackjacks. Most of us consider those to be weed. We don't like spinach because they've got this distinct taste as opposed to when you eat spinach or any other leafy vegetables that are commonly consumed in your other areas, townships and suburban areas. So what happened was when I moved to the big cities, I didn't find these indigenous food crops. And for me, that was a huge challenge, culture shock, in fact, such that I had to ask them to send somebody to bring me food in the city. That is how much I valued my food. To this day, I am concentrating on food in my career because uh, food played a significant role in my life. Your madumbis, your isijingis, I cannot be separated from those because I think they form part of who I am, and without them, I don't think I would survive.
Avida, do you want
Thanks,
to
Qinsane.
Yeah, sure, I'll go.
Why
So,
don't you go, Tapiwa?
oh, you go, Tapiwa.
go? Okay, I'll go. So I grew up in the city, but very connected to my food roots. My grandparents, as much as we lived in the city, in Zimbabwe, it's a little bit different because space wasn't as big a problem as it is in South Africa. So even if you weren't in the suburbs, you still had access to a bit more land than you would expect to see in South Africa. So we grew up with fruits and vegetables and animals that we kept on the property in our local neighborhood that reflected the country's food history. And but also on the weekends, you'd often be in the village almost every weekend. And wild fruits and wild grains and African grains were always being imported into the cities as well. Anyway, so I grew up with a very strong connection and sense of belonging to foods from Zimbabwe at the very least. And but I also grew up with a very mixed family. So we always had cousins who were not from within Zimbabwe. And my family friends from all my parents, so they were very global people. So I was eating Nigerian food, Kenyan food, Ugandan food from a very young age, and global food in general. So I was fortunate enough to grow up in this context where I've never been one to say I don't eat that stuff because we grew up with this is what's available today. Are you going to eat or not? And we don't belittle food and we don't belittle other people's foods. And you also don't eat alone. We're really encouraged to, if you go to the orchard to go get some guavas, you better come back with guavas for everybody who's in that house that day, you know. So I grew up in a communal sense around food.
Aabida.
Yes. So, I mean, I grew up in your stereotypical urban Cape Townian environment. So, I'm that person where the description was targeted at. I grew up with familiar flavors of vanilla and chocolate and strawberry and white bread. Like I'm that human and cheese. Um, but for me, food is what Jane was talking about and what Scott was talking about. It's an emotional, tangible thing. Um, and growing up also in a Muslim environment, community and eating together um, and being mindful of consumption was something that was ingrained in me from a very young age. So we would often eat fish, so we would eat the whole fish, including the fish eyes. And I love the fish eyes. And then when I went to high school, people would look, and I went to a very white high school, and people would look at me like, "Why are you eating fish eyes?"
or the marrow of a meat bone that was prized. And yet, when I go into other environments, it's like, oh, the marrow of a meat bone, what is it doing here? Like, this isn't food. Like, you discard this. Or a chicken bone. Like, I love, like, the entire chicken bone. So I'm shocked when people, like, leave all of this chicken off a piece of chicken bone. So for me, that's how I grew up. So I grew up with your chocolate flavored things, and your peanut butters. Like, peanut butter was an absolute treat. Um, but it was appreciating all of the food.
I think that really speaks to something, colonizing our diets that I think has definitely come with westernized culture is this idea that not everything needs to be utilized, and there's a big sort of emphasis on separation of things. So, Qinsane, yes, go
I
ahead.
find what Aabida is saying to be quite interesting. I'm reminded of Togo, when we were young back home, we used to have indigenous chickens, your free range indigenous chickens. And whenever they were slaughtered, the neighbor would ask us to come so that we enjoy the meal with them, vice versa. But then this one time, we realized that our neighbors' kids were actually eating chicken eyes. And for us, that was a major shock because we'd never seen that, such that they would fight over the eyes. It's quite interesting to learn that other people eat fish eyes. That's a nice one, Abida.
Yeah, it's delicious.
Yeah, and
I haven't
I
tried it. It's so good, especially over a fire.
I'll try it.
well, Abida's put us onto something. So I'm curious to hear from each of you because not only, in the case of Tapiwa and Abida, have you guys sort of taken this connection to food and this interest in working sustainably with food as well into creating businesses. But all three of you are also engaged in research or have engaged in research. Qinsane, you have a PhD engaged in that kind of research. So I'm wondering what drew you to indigenous or African flavors, to exploring those, and to also taking those ideas and exploring them through academia.
Well, it was actually sparked by my frustration. Remember, I mentioned earlier that I moved to the big cities, Durban being the first and Pretoria being the second. And it was seriously frustrating for me, especially when I got to Pretoria, because I couldn't find amadumbe. I can't live without amadumbe. I have to eat them every time, at least every month. I must have access to amadumbe, seasonal as they are. So when we were given a research project, I said I want to look at indigenous food crops because there was still this buzz around food security in the agri space. I studied agriculture, so I then said my focus is going to be these indigenous foods, and also because they connected me. I felt they connected me to my late great grandmother, who used to ensure that I am with her whenever she is working these indigenous crops. So it then became a thing. From there, my love for indigenous food grew. The research part of it grew, and I carried it on to my master's and PhD, and now uh, my everyday work.
Yeah, congratulations on that, by the
Thank
way.
you.
Abida?
So I mean, similarly in terms of I was annoyed as well. Um, so I did my master's at the Sustainability Institute in Stellenbosch. And when I got there was all this talk about like food security and sustainability, and it sparked something within me that, like I said in the big earlier on, that food is something tangible that can connect everyone, but it also shows inequality so starkly, right? You can't get away from this thing of inequality and food. It's so evident. So then I did my master's and I started a market in Khayelitsha, which is a township on the outskirts of Cape Town, looking at access to healthy food by those living in urban township. And then I started with this group of like really cool guys, and they've always wanted to start a market. So we started an Impilo market, and they introduced me to this idea of indigenous foods and what does indigenous foods actually mean and what does it look like. And now for research and for my PhD now that I'm doing, it's again taking that concept of using religion and saying, but what does religion and faith and spirituality say about how we eat an indigenous and local and not over exploiting? And then similarly with the business and the Juicery, it's how do we make these things that maybe us as academics or people who are hyper local have this knowledge, how do we increase that knowledge? And for me, one of the easiest ways was to make a juice. Like make a juice, add some local ingredients to it, and then see what happens.
Tapiwa?
I think the overall theme here is frustration and an opportunity to change something in the world. so I was an academic for 15 years, so studies until postdoc. And in that time, all my work was focused on, I was a molecular biologist, and my research was around crop improvement of plants that are not from the continent or that are not synonymous with the continent. And as an immigrant, I never used to really connect with the struggle of blackness in South Africa until I stopped being a student. I think there's a lot of pressure to really have time to introspect on the bigger problems you see in the world. So when I started my postdoc at Stellenbosch, it was my first sort of proper exposure to why Black people are so angry about apartheid, about South Africa's state of being. And because I've chosen to not have children and the way I relate with my partners, and I refuse to play black tax, there are a lot of things I've chosen not to do that empower me to do this kind of work for the greater good. I felt strongly that if someone in my position can't fight for our cultures, for our things on this continent, how can I expect maybe a single parent of 3 who's also 16 to fight for this kind of work? So I felt it quite important, quite urgent to say, well, my life is pretty simple, relatively speaking. I don't have any dependence, and I see a problem in the world. I think I should do something about it. And that's how I got into this work.
Yeah, thank you all for those incredible answers. I mean, I think it's really commendable what all of you have set out to achieve, not just with your academic work, but in terms of creating communities around that, whether that's, sharing things online or even just being part of this panel, trying to, spread that awareness, because something that we do deal with a lot, I think, not just as South Africans, but as Africans, is because we have such a deep-rooted colonial history. So much of our own history, so much of our own knowledge and teachings is being lost and has been lost. And I want to touch on something that Jane mentioned as well, this sense of losing our food. Do you feel like there's a sense of losing a connection to our food heritage?
I think that's a global problem. Like Jane mentioned as well, globalization has done a number on everything. It's not a unique problem to South Africa and to Africa. And we're losing it in the name of cultural exchange. But the cultural exchange is so aggressive that it's more like cultural suppression by other primary cultures, right? So I'm acutely aware that we are losing things. In part because of colonial legacy, but a huge part of it is active colonization now, where it's also obvious that it's a particular country that's colonizing a people, but you can see a system working. You can see breeding programs that are displacing things still today. You can see music, you can see art that's just displacing everything, like even displacing our humanity. It frustrates me that you are able to get Uber Eats, Mr. Delivery, all these things so easy, so readily for fluff food, right? For unnecessary food, or even going to a fine restaurant. For me, that should be a once in a lifetime or once in a decade kind of experience. It's not necessary to eat fine dining at all, right? And we are all rushing these things to our foods as well. So we're doing this fine dining thing, but we're taking French techniques only, and then you put a bit of sprinkle of your own thing on top. So there's so many different ways that we're being colonized, but we are also actively participating in our own erasure in the name of evolution of culture or contributing to culture. And there's a balance we need to figure out there. Like, how do we, because culture is never going to be stagnant, that's a lie. But how do we preserve some things and how do we contribute to our cultures in a way that moves us forward without displacing ourselves in that conversation?
Yes, Qinsane.
Muted. Okay, I've been unmuted now. I agree with you, Tapiwa. There is a disconnect, Scout. I would like to say media has an influence in what we are seeing currently in terms of the foods that we consume. I think if you think about it, if you watch television, if you listen to radio, and if you walk around, everything is never. Nothing is ever about our indigenous foods. It's never about our African foods. It's all foods from somewhere, foods that we don't even know. Uh, I laughed the other day when these two retailers were mocking each other. One asking, "So which part of the chicken nuggets?" I think they were talking about nuggets. I've forgotten. But for me, uh, if we are exposed to the Western cuisines, then what would be the expectation in terms of what is popular in our communities? I think it makes sense that we would see more uh, communities consuming these westernized foods as opposed to our very own. And also, our very own would be abandoned because nobody would then give them that much interest. As a result, they would end up declining, as Jane mentioned earlier. They would end up declining because nobody is looking after our own and nobody is reproducing them. I can give you an example of one of the crops known as Injungu. I've forgotten. Momorica fortita is the scientific name. You hardly find it now in areas where it used to grow if you go to the northern KZN. And that's concerning because that crop was known to be very helpful for people that have diabetes or rather had diabetes at the time. Now you have to travel across the country. You have to go to Mpumalanga to get that crop if you are lucky to get that. It's a vegetative crop, but you are most likely to get it in Mozambique if you really want it. So yes, I'm agreeing with what Tapiwa is saying. There is that disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, I mean, the disconnect has always been there, I think. So I think I have a little bit of a different view on it, is that the disconnect has always, growing up in an urban environment, like Cape Town, that disconnect has always been there. Not understanding like wild foods and what foods just grow here naturally. So it's only now as an adult and I'm learning what is grow naturally. But from a cultural perspective, just the whole idea, what Tapiwa was saying, like the whole idea of food has changed. Like this Uber Eats, Mr. D culture, to me, is eroding a lot more than just like people's levels of health. It's eroding like the whole sense and concept of food. You don't get the family community aspect of eating together anymore. When you order on Uber Eats and Mr. D, it's this fast food culture. And I mean, we can just look at what happened with crime. the beverage that was launched the other day in South Africa, how crazy South Africans went to support this beverage that's from this random influencer guy in America. But we don't go on like that for our own stuff. Like we are the cues for our own people. And it's not better tasting and nutritionally more adequate than fine. So I think like we've got to be so wise in terms of how we kind of speak about these indigenous things and ingredients and food, because also we don't want to have a case where big corporate just monopolizes that industry as well, like in the case of rooibos, where there are like monocrop farms of rooibos. So I don't know. It's just it's a mindful thing and something that's always like passing around in my heart.
Hmm.
No, for sure. Go ahead,
Yeah, I
Qinsane.
think Abida just touched on something very important there. In your indigenous communities, you would often find people gathering. There would be a tray full of sweet potatoes, madumbis, or whatever crops, and they would all be eating. But while that happens, there would be conversations that would be going on. Folklore stories, I recall from when I was still young, they would be told during that time. And that has been taken away from us. There would be neighbors joining, and we would hear even more stories. And it would create that bond between uh, the family and also the neighbors. But the introduction of the Western foods, or rather the overconsumption of Western foods over our very own, has taken away that. It has taken away the social uh, element that comes with consuming these indigenous foods, or rather utilizing them holistically in whatever manner that they were utilized back in the day.
Yeah, I want to add to that as well. This is really an important point for me to always remember is um, be- beyond food, we are being trained, and we've been trained for a while now to become experts in whatever thing, right? If you are going to be an academic, you're going to know that one specific protein from that one plant for the rest of your life. You're going to be a musician, all you do is Afro jazz. That's it. There's no room for anything else. But we forget that human beings as an animal, the reason we've been so successful in growing across the world is we are good at being mediocre at everything. But mediocre at such a level that we can accomplish so much more, right? Like none of us can run as fast as a cheetah, swim as good as a dolphin, or blah 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 blah. But there is no other animal that does such a good job of so many different things. And if we're talking about food, I grew up, I would grow the peanuts, I would weed the peanuts, I would harvest the peanuts, I would thresh the peanuts, I would roast the peanuts, I would make the peanut butter, and. So I grew up in a context where I know what it means to say I've made this meal. And even our rituals around that meal acknowledge all that labor. So we say Pamsoroe, you clap your hands, and it's an acknowledgement of the whole ecosystem, how everything has come together for this particular moment. The chicken head, the feathers from the chicken going to the fire for firewood, the corn cob is burnt, and there's this holistic approach to the whole experience that we lose when food is just a click away. It's so easy to think food comes from pick and pay, you know, and consequently, people who farm food, who grow food, are not valued, and that's why we pay the chef money, but we don't pay the farmer at the same level of dignity, because we think food comes from a chef. We don't understand food is something I can grow myself right now. If you give someone a butternut and tell them to save the seeds, they have no idea what you're talking about. Save the seeds from for what? You know, I can go buy another one. It's this huge disconnection. So for me, it's really important for people to connect with the entirety of the ecosystem and what it means to grow something and let it regrow every year or with each cycle, as opposed to swipe my card and I'm sorted.
Yeah. No, I mean, the act of growing something is a labor of love. Food is something that, just picking up from what you've said and what you've also mentioned, Qinsane, is food has to be earned. Especially when you're not just like going and buying it from the store or ordering it from Mr. Delivery. And speaking of, the way our cultures around food have changed, because food was used to be something that was a communal experience. We cook together, we eat together, we grow the food together, we harvest the food together. And now that has changed so completely. And maybe even more rapidly so over the last 2 years with COVID and people being more and more isolated. So I'm wondering, in this context, what is it like introducing new flavors into the South African market?
For me, it's really important to be clear on what you're trying to do, right? So if your point is to make money and put the spin on it and say, well, we do locally supplied, locally grown, blah 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 blah, go for it. But I'm very clear why I'm doing what I'm doing, and that clarity allows me to say no to a lot of nonsense and to be a bit more insistent, a bit more aggressive with my methods and my approach. So I try not to pander to people. If you don't like what I'm doing, move on. I try and be insistent on using approachable foods, yes, but insisting on the language choices around that food, insisting on trying to minimize how I gentrify that food, right? Because for me, for example, ice cream, I think it's important to have ice cream flavors that reflect where we live, but I'm also aware of the gentrification of our foods through ice cream that I'm making. And I need to be very clear on that. In the same way, if we're doing the juices, if we're doing our gins, if we're doing our whatevers, all these more globally accepted concepts that have a sprinkle of Africanness on top, all that work is really important. But we can't do that while forsaking our own, because we've got hella food techniques, cooking vessels, cooking techniques, ingredients, preparations that we need to be moving along with us. As much as I can do a lot of things in Japanese cook technique, I need to be able to do a lot of things in Shona cooking technique as well. And be proud of those things and be bold and aggressive in the defense and protection of those things to a point where it needs to come almost from a place of arrogance to say, yes, this is what I'm about and I'm really proud of it. And it's got value, it's got worth. And I'm not trying to pander to you to accept it. I'm trying to insist on you knowing about it and knowing that this should be more prevalent than wheat, than grapes, than strawberries, and whatever. Yeah.
Sorry if I may follow that. Scout, would you mind repeating the question? Did you say what does it mean introducing,
Sure.
or how easy is it to introduce?
Yeah, what is it like trying to introduce new flavors into the South African market? And maybe new is not the right word, but indigenous flavors, because those are not necessarily what's popular.
I wonder if I
Um,
would have a response to that. But if I may, you can go ahead, Aabida.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, I think like for me, it's like even just grappling with those words that you're using. So like new, indigenous, and South African. It's so weird because I'm so mindful of the fact that like back in the day, I came from a ship. I was imported from another country. My ancestors were slaves. I was brought here as a product of colonialism, and what does that mean in terms of and new and indigenous? So I'm obsessed with fufu. Like I love fufu. I love the way it tastes. I love the way it smells. I love the different rice and everything that you can do with it. So I'm at Opus Football in Woodstock every Saturday and Sunday. And so my target audience, sometimes South Africans, but oftentimes international people. And I find that are willing to try new ingredients or something new because they're on holiday. So they're in holiday mode. So everything is an adventure. We're South Africans, and I don't know like they have this idea of, oh, this is my money that I've worked for, so I'm not necessarily going to use my money right now on trying something new. If I want a beverage, I'll go for maybe rooibos because that's how I grew up with rooibos, or I'll go for a green juice, which is terrible for them, but that's what they know and that's what they associate with healthy. So I do sometimes find that South Africans, in that context at least, it's almost like they trend followers. And I've turned people away from my stand so many times because like they just annoy me. Like it's like I'm like, yes, I would love the money, but like your whole attitude towards me, your vibe, it's wrong. Go somewhere else. It's okay, keep it. So I don't know. Sometimes I do feel that's what I wish we were a little bit more risk taking, but maybe it's got to do with the fact that we're not on holiday, and so we're quite conservative when it comes to how we're spending our money and our time on it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. If you're in a different African country, you would find the locals will be behaving exactly how you're describing it.
Yeah.
So it's we've got a bit of a blinker situation because we only see ourselves here. But when I go back home to Zim, I see the same thing as well. But you raised something really powerful as well around the word choices that we use, and how you're talking about the complexity of your history as a South African whose ancestry was transplanted from somewhere else in part, right?
Yeah.
I was in Berlin for a food conference last year, and I remember struggling with the idea of taking my African ice cream to Berlin. Why would I do that? You know, not realizing the organization that was inviting me was Black German, right? So this idea of Africanness versus Blackness for me was really rocked because I show up in Germany and there's so many people who we would call colored in this South African context who are strongly Black, right? And they're like, we're so glad you came, we've been waiting for you. So I realized the languaging that I had been so comfortable with is so challenging because now I don't normally say indigenous food, right? I would say continental food or local food, because when I think of like a lot of Cape Malay food, for example, most of it at an atomic level has nothing to do with Africa in terms of ingredient choices, but you cannot deny its Africanness, right? In the same way, plantain, jollof, salad in Kenya, none of those things say cinnamon, ginger, cardamom, whatever, nothing to do with Africa. But you cannot remove those dishes from Africanness, you know? And they're not indigenous in the way of this thing evolved here as a plant or an animal, but they're indigenous in their cultural significance to the people from this place. So we need to figure out other languaging things and how to let go of these names and titles, because eventually I should hope we get to a point where we can say I'm having food, and what that means is I'm eating food from this place. Once in a while, I'll say I'm having Italian food to make the point of highlighting the thing that's not from here. In the same way, once in a while, I should be able to say I'm wearing clothes that are from Italy. But what we do now, we say we're wearing African clothes for September because it's Heritage Month. Instead of saying I'm wearing clothes. Yeah. So the languaging, I agree with you so much, Aabida. It's so important that we figure out how to use these words in a way that reflects the reality of where we are without disenfranchising so many people who are Africans by a very complicated route. Yeah.
I think. Oh, I'm still muted.
No, you're good.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I think that's why now we are shifting away from using terms like your local foods, your indigenous foods, to African foods. If we are talking about foods that are originally from Nigeria, Malawi, wherever, we are no longer using the terms indigenous foods. It's only a few of us that are still stuck up on that term. And I think that is going to help when we want to distinguish between your Italian and our local cuisines. By local, I mean continental cuisines, without really being specific as to whether you're referring to South Africa or Nigeria.
Yeah, I'd like to backpedal a little bit just to something that came earlier in the conversation, talking about, inhabiting or coming from urban spaces and what that means in terms of, creating food, creating indigenous food, creating African food, or, maintaining that connection to your food heritage. And so I want to know, where do you source your ingredients? And maybe this is more pointed towards Aabida and Tapiwa. Is it easy to find, or is it expensive? And how can we begin incorporating these ingredients into our everyday food practices? If, like we've mentioned, a lot of the hurdles around those things is maybe those foods are not available, say in supermarkets or shops. You have to know exactly where to go, which local store. Maybe it's only available in another province. I'm wondering how many of the ingredients that you use are actually accessible, and like we've said before, there is a great inequality in terms of food, where our food prices are incredibly high, and really things that are seen as maybe healthier or more exotic seeming because they are outside of the norm of what we're used to, are also therefore more expensive.
I want to quote what Jane said earlier on in the video about being a trailblazer, and put a little spin on it. So the way I look at it currently, I see myself and all of us as ancestors. All right. We're all working on our own behalf with this work. Right. We may see some benefit. We may enjoy some of the fruits of our labor, as it were. But we need to think about this as, if it took 400 or 500 years to get here, we need 400 or 500 years to move to a new place, right? So if we're doing this work with that vision in mind, you have to realize and accept it's going to be painful and difficult for most of us, which means insisting on maybe spending more money on these products to increase demand, insist on being a problematic customer. When you're in Pick and Pay, where is the fonio? I want fonio. Why can I get 7 kinds of wheat? Why can't I get this thing? You're giving me quinoa. Why can't I get red finger millet? We need to be comfortable with being the ones who suffer on behalf of who's to come, right? And the way I see it for myself is, I have a limited shelf life of how much pain and suffering I'm willing to go through. And I think it's up to anyone who is in some kind of activist position to say, for a certain amount of time, I'm going to do this for the culture. It's going to be difficult, and it's going to be a struggle. And when I feel like I've done what I can, I should also be okay saying, I'm walking away, I've done my part. Someone else pick up this baton. So for me, with Tapi Tapi, I'm very clear I'm not going to fix anything. But every single day is an opportunity for a customer to be the person whose mind I've adjusted, who's going to fix the things that I can't fix. That's how I'm looking at this thing. It's a very big problem. And as individuals, we're going to do very little. But hopefully, I'm going to influence a policymaker, someone in government, someone who can incentivize farmers to grow sorghum and tax people who grow wheat, tax people who grow grapes, tax people who grow strawberries. That's what I'm hoping for. Can I impact someone who can do a much bigger job with very little effort versus my huge effort with very little consequence?
That's a very profound answer, Tapiwa. I have a very pragmatic answer to that question. So For me, getting the raw sugar cane is very easy. I know a farmer up in KZN and I can get it. The difficulty, just from like a small business perspective, is getting it from the farmer to me. Because he's there and he's growing his raw sugar cane for the guys in Durban, and that's what he does. But now, how do I get that to Cape Town, being a small business owner? When you have, like, we were talking about access earlier on. So one of the barriers to access is this missing middle in terms of logistics and transport. It's the minimum order quantity that's needed to bring it down. If you use one of the big guys, it's ridiculous. It's like a whole back of a truck. That big container thing. I don't know how big it is in terms of size, but that big thing. So now I must use like a guy with a bucket, which is fine. But do I tell people that I'm using a guy with a bucket to bring my stuff down? Tapiwa brought up sorghum. I've been wanting to at least introduce the option of sweet sorghum, right? As an alternative to raw sugarcane. But I can't find sweet sorghum. I can find the dried sorghum, the savory one, everywhere, right? Like for me, it's very easy to find any dry indigenous ingredients. But sweet sorghum, everyone says, no, go talk to this lady under the bridge. She's there on a Tuesday at 3 p.m. And I'm like, okay. And then I go there and I can't find the lady under the bridge at 3 p.m. So in terms of like really like certain things, it's really easy to find. But it's that missing middle, which is a problem in terms of logistics and transport, and sweet sorghum, which would be perfect. I know Muse Farm in Hout Bay, but the quantity that she does is not sufficient enough for a weekend market setting as well. That's also the problem. We might be growing these things, but at what quantities? And also, maybe we should change our mindset and my mindset about like this capitalistic quantities that we need to break even.
On that point, Aabida, I was involved in an African potato farming project. So there's this one guy who deals with indigenous medicine. Now he's the only one that uses African potato for his medication, for his medicine. And the owner of the project, I was assisting, the owner of the project had to shut down because they only had to produce so much on a limited scale for starters. Secondly, they only had one buyer. And thirdly, that meant that they were not generating any income because there weren't many people that were using African potato. And I think that's the case with many of our indigenous plants that are being produced out there. We don't have many people utilizing them, such that it has an effect on the one who is producing. They end up not producing, and up until a time comes when such people are recognized, the people that are actually reproducing these indigenous crops are given something, or rather recognized in some way, then it means they are going to keep on declining and declining and declining as we are seeing now. I don't think I'm ever going to see African potato in the area where we were running that project. For starters, I haven't seen African potato elsewhere, by the way. Yet it is meant to be an indigenous crop. So I think those are the challenges that we are facing.
To add to that as well, I always find it fascinating that I can get so much continental produce so easily in Cape Town than I can South African produce. I can get stuff from Senegal right now, from Kenya, from Benin, from Ghana very readily. And part of that is when other Africans come here, they bring their homes here. They make a point of insisting on bringing their homes here. And I think as a country right now, there's also a lack of knowledge around what. When you think of a South African food menu right now, I can tell you what you're picturing. You're picturing pap, seven colors, shakalaka, scopo, ulusu, magwinya, dombolo. That is such a lie of a menu, right? In the same way, Chinese American food is so different to Chinese food, right? So there's a lack of knowledge within the country about what it means to eat Tsonga food, what it means to eat Zulu food, Pedi food, Shangani food. And that's a big part of the problem. You can't find those things because the cuisine of the country is now a monoculture as opposed to the many tribal cuisines within the country, which then means it's wheat, it's maize, it's cabbage, it's carrots, it's beetroot. And those things are really available because that's not what we associate with South African cuisine. And the things that are from the OGs are not available because no one is cooking those things. And no one thinks of those things when they think of their own traditional foods. If you grew up in Langa, odds are you don't even know what matungulu are or umslonyane or umkokolo, whatever, right? So you think you know your food because for 2 generations that is your food. But before that, you've lost touch with that thing, yeah.
I just want to thank you all for your wonderful contributions to this conversation. And I'm sorry to say that we are running out of time. So I'd like to now give audience members an opportunity to put their questions through if they have any questions for the panel. And in the meantime, we're going to go to our last video, and then we'll come back and do some questions quickly. So our last video is going to be from Mokgaetji, Georginah, Mokganya.
Ask me about wild edible vegetables. I will definitely tell you that I was informed by my knowledgeable mother. The beautiful thing about the wild edible vegetables is that they grow naturally and can resist stress that may be of any form. Harvest them and sell them to boost your income. Prepare them to enjoy a nutritious dish for lunch suitable for any day of the week.
All right. So I'm just going to take a moment. Do we have any questions from anybody watching? Any screamers? And then maybe just in closing, while we wait to see if there's any other questions, my last question is what can you recommend to people wanting to work in food arts or in gastronomy, or who are just really interested in, connecting to their own food culture, connecting to food cultures that already exist but have been marginalized, as we've said, by Western food practices, by fast food culture. What can you recommend?
Well, for me, on the production side, particularly, I would say just connect with people in the industry. We've got so many players because I come from agriculture. We've got so many people that are trying, a growing number of people that are trying to push the indigenous foods agenda. They are producing, others are processing, and so on and so forth. The quickest way for all of us to grow is if we work collaboratively with one another. So just find those links, work with others, team up with others. That would be my advice.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. Community is really important. It's very hard to remember that you're not the only one doing this, although it may feel like that all the time.
Yes.
So community helps with that feeling of isolation and loneliness in those spaces, because none of us here, I would say, are pioneers. This is old work. But we all think we're starting something new all the time, because I found a new problem, let me solve this problem. But actually, if you just open up your gaze a lot more, someone is trying to tackle the same issues. And also, don't let the community stop in food. Do collaborations outside of food as well.
Just sorry to cut you off, Aabida. We do have a question from somebody in the audience, and we are running out of time slightly. So I'm going to ask somebody to quickly give us a nice, quick answer. And the question comes from Ntuli Xolani. How can I combine art and agriculture?
Oh, I was gonna say Aabida can go for it, but shit, we've lost her. Go for it, brother.
All right.
I thought you were well positioned for this one.
Anyone, anybody can go.
I think it's all the same thing. I think it's all the same. I don't really see the barrier to say I only do art now or only do agriculture. I think it's part of the same expression system as a human being. So I'm currently doing a nice example is I'm doing a project showing spatial apartheid in the Western Cape, where I'm using plant seeds grown in a patch of land to represent the spatial density in the Western Cape, and how plants grow under crowded conditions are malnourished versus plants growing in Constantia on my little garden patch do so much better. So there's so many ways you can go for this kind of thing.
But also Tapiwa, I think what you're currently doing is actually an answer to what is being asked here, combining art and agriculture. Not only are you producing, I'm not sure if you're producing, but I definitely know that you're making ice cream from indigenous foods. So I think what you're doing in itself is art. But then there was an agricultural element in the background. We see the final product, which is more art, but then there was a producer.
Yeah, and you're driving demand for that producer as well, and
Yes.
that kind of work. Yeah.
So just being innovative, Nduli Kolani, I think that's the person that asked. Just being innovative. If you are producing or if you're buying things and you want to process, just be creative. I guess. I think that's what art is about. Not necessarily drawing pictures and displaying them somewhere.
Thank you both so much for your answers. I wanted to give Aabida a chance to respond, but it seems like we've lost her again. But in closing, I just want to thank all of you for your time and for this wonderful conversation that we've been able to have, really giving us, the chance to think more deeply about how we're connected to food, how we're using food, and raising some important issues around, it's such a primary part of our culture of life in general. We need food to survive, but I do feel like so many things, so many points that were raised during this panel, they don't get discussed enough, and they don't get discussed in community enough. We have maybe small conversations on our own with people who are interested in the same things as us, or dealing with those kinds of topics, but it's not necessarily a communal conversation yet. So hopefully this is the first step in that direction. I want to thank you, Tapiwa, Aabida, Qinsane, who also lost now. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everybody who's joined in this evening. Thank you to our funders. Thank you to the partners this year, the Dennis Hurley Center, Alliance Française d'Urban, UKZN, Centre for Creative Arts, and the University of Antwerp. Thank you so much for everybody who's joined in. It's been a pleasure to have you guys as part of the Artfluence Festival.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you as well.